At 3:17 in the morning, in the cold pre-dawn over Kursk Oblast, the radar operators inside one of Russia's most prized fighter air bases were tracking what their training told them was background clutter. Slow returns, low altitude, almost no metallic signature. Wind-driven debris, they thought. Birds, maybe. The kind of contact that gets filtered out, dismissed, ignored. And while those operators dismissed it, a swarm of Australian-built waxed cardboard aircraft, costing somewhere between $700 and $3,500 apiece, was already inside the perimeter. Within minutes, 4 Sukhoi Su-30 multi-role fighters and 1 MiG-29 were burning on the apron. 2 Pantsir S-1 short-range air defense systems, the very systems designed to swat exactly this kind of threat, were damaged. An S-300 surface-to-air launcher was hit. Fuel bowsers cracked open, and the most expensive air defense doctrine Russia inherited from the Soviet Union failed in a single night to objects that, in flat-pack form, looked like flat-pack furniture from a hardware store. This is not a story about a clever gadget. This is a story about an entire generation of Russian air defense assumptions collapsing against a piece of folded cardboard. And the longer you look at it, the less it resembles an incident, and the more it resembles a verdict. I want to be very clear with you about what you are watching. You are not watching Ukrainian improvisation. You are watching the deliberate weaponization of material science, supply chain economics, and radar physics against a force that built its doctrine on the assumption that cheap things cannot kill expensive things. That assumption is now finished. And what happens next changes everything about how this war, and frankly the next war, will be fought. Let me pull the lens back and show you why this was always going to happen. For 30 years, Russian air defense doctrine rested on 3 pillars. The first pillar was layered detection. Long-range surveillance radars cueing medium-range systems, cueing terminal-range point defense, like the Pantsir S-1, which was specifically marketed as the answer to small precision threats. The second pillar was kinetic interception, missiles for high-value contacts, 30mm autocannons for everything else. The third pillar, and this is the one that matters tonight, was target qualification. The doctrine assumed that any threat worth engaging would have a recognizable radar cross-section, a recognizable thermal signature, and a recognizable flight profile. A jet, a cruise missile, an unmanned combat aerial vehicle in the Bayraktar class, these things look like threats. They light up the screen. They behave like enemies. Cardboard does none of those things. Waxed corrugated cardboard, reinforced with foam and rubber bands, stretched across a 1.8-meter wingspan, propelled by a small electric motor, cruising at 60 kilometers per hour at low altitude, carrying a 3-kilogram payload up to 120 kilometers. This object is, from a radar perspective, almost not there. Its dielectric properties are closer to a flock of birds than to a strike aircraft. Its thermal signature is closer to a household drone than to a military munition. And its acoustic signature, at the altitudes it was operating, was masked by ground wind. So when the Security Service of Ukraine, the SBU, launched their swarm, the Russian defenders were not failing to react quickly. They were failing to react at all, because their detection architecture was not built to see what was coming. The system did not break. The system was bypassed. And that distinction is the difference between a tactical incident and a doctrinal collapse. Now, mainstream coverage of this story tends to focus on the visual irony: cardboard versus Sukhoi, plywood versus precision, hobbyist materials versus billion-dollar air power. That framing is satisfying and it gets clicks, but it is shallow. It misses what is actually happening here. Because the real question is not whether cardboard can hurt a Su-30. The real question is what kind of force structure can be defeated by 16 pieces of cardboard launched from a clearing, and how many other forces in the world are currently built on the same brittle assumptions that just failed Russia at Kursk. Let me walk you through what this actually means at the strategic level. The SIPAC Corvo Precision Payload Delivery System was not designed as a weapon. It was designed by an Australian engineering firm as a humanitarian and logistics platform, a disposable cargo drone that could be flat-packed, shipped in a box the size of a pizza delivery, assembled in the field in under an hour by a soldier with no specialist training, and flown one way to a target coordinate. Australia funded the initial program for the Australian Defence Force as part of a low-cost autonomous systems initiative. The unit cost was kept deliberately low, somewhere in the $3,000 to $3,500 range depending on configuration. The aircraft was meant to be lost. That was the point. Disposability was a feature, not a defect. Ukraine received an initial tranche of these systems in early 2023 under an Australian government contract reported at around 33 million Australian dollars for roughly 100 units a month. And here is where Ukrainian doctrine did something that frankly no Western military planner anticipated. They did not use the Corvo as a logistics drone. They reverse engineered its tactical implications. They asked the question every adaptive force eventually asks. If the enemy cannot see this object, what else can we do with it? The answer, as we now know, was deep strike against high-value parked aircraft. And it gets even more serious from here. Because parked aircraft are the softest target in any modern air force. A Su-30 in flight is one of the most survivable platforms in the Russian inventory. A Su-30 on the ground, fueled, armed, parked in the open, or under a thin sun shelter, is a stationary, fragile, fuel-soaked target with no countermeasures, no electronic warfare suite active, and no pilot in the seat. Air forces around the world spend enormous resources hardening their aircraft in flight, and almost none hardening them on the ground. That gap is what Ukraine exploited. Now hold that thought because the pattern repeats. Pull the lens back further. In May 2023, Ukrainian drones struck the Kremlin itself. In August 2023, the cardboard strike at Kursk damaged at least 5 aircraft. Through 2023 and 2024, Ukrainian strikes hit Engels 2, Soltsy 2, Diaghilevo, bases hosting Tu-95 and Tu-22M3 strategic bombers, aircraft that are physically irreplaceable because the production lines closed decades ago. And then, in June 2024, Operation Spiderweb, the SBU's audacious smuggling of FPV drones inside trucks deep into Russian territory, launched simultaneously against 4 air bases, damaging or destroying more than a third of Russia's strategic bomber fleet in a single afternoon. The cardboard strike at Kursk was not an anomaly. It was the prototype. It was the doctrinal proof of concept that made Spiderweb possible, and the lineage runs directly from one to the other. This matters enormously because what we are watching is not a series of clever Ukrainian raids. We are watching the construction in real time of a new category of warfare. Call it asymmetric deep strike via disposable autonomy. The doctrine is simple. Identify a high-value enemy asset that is expensive to replace, slow to manufacture, and parked in a predictable location. Strike it with a swarm of platforms whose unit cost is so low that the exchange ratio is mathematically catastrophic for the defender. A Su-30 costs Russia somewhere between $30 and $50 million. A cardboard Corvo costs $3,000. That is an exchange ratio of more than 10,000 to 1. There is no air defense system in the world that can sustain that math. Not Pantsir, not Tor, not Patriot, not Iron Dome. The economics break before the kinetics do. Let me walk you through what that means industrially, because this is where the consequence stops being tactical and starts becoming state level. Russia entered this war with an aviation industrial base that was already fragile. The Komsomolsk-on-Amur production line for the Su-30 and Su-35 series operates at a rate of, by most credible Western estimates, fewer than 15 advanced fighter airframes per year. The MiG-29 line has effectively been dormant for export only. The Tu-95 and Tu-22M3 production lines, as I mentioned, no longer exist. Every airframe Ukraine destroys on the ground is an airframe that Russia cannot easily replace in months, in years, or in some cases, in decades. The strategic bomber fleet, in particular, is a wasting asset. Each loss is permanent. Now apply the cardboard math to that. If 16 Corvo drones costing under $50,000 total can damage 5 frontline fighters worth $200 million, the question is no longer whether Ukraine can sustain this campaign. The question is whether Russia can sustain its air force under it. And the answer, based on the visible attrition curve, is no. Russia is not losing its air force in dogfights. It is losing it on the ground, to objects it cannot see, launched from clearings it cannot find, by an enemy that has fully internalized a doctrine Russia still does not understand. And this is the moment where mainstream framing breaks down completely. Because the popular narrative, the cardboard drone as scrappy underdog, as plucky improvisation, as Ukrainian ingenuity, fundamentally misreads what is happening. This is not improvisation. This is industrial grade asymmetry. Australia provided the airframe. Ukraine provided the doctrine. The SBU and the GUR provided the targeting intelligence, much of it almost certainly cross-referenced with Western satellite imagery and signals data. Open source analysts on Telegram and Twitter, frankly, contributed more than most people realize by geolocating Russian aircraft positions in near real time. This is a coalition product, executed by Ukraine against a Russian force whose doctrine assumed that strategic depth meant strategic safety. Strategic depth is dead. Let that sink in. The single most important assumption of Russian defensive posture since 1945, that distance from the front line equals security for high-value assets, has been falsified by an aircraft made of corrugated cardboard. Kursk is roughly 90 kilometers from the Ukrainian border. Engels, too, is over 600 kilometers. Olenya, hit during Spiderweb, is more than 1,800 kilometers from Ukraine. The cardboard drone proved the principle. The follow-on operations proved the range. And the strategic implication is now undeniable. There is no longer such a thing as a safe rear area in modern Russian military geography. Pull the lens back one more time because the consequence goes further than Russia. Every major air force in the world is currently looking at parked aircraft on open aprons and asking the same question. The United States, China, France, Britain, Israel, every one of them. Because the cardboard drone is not a Russian problem, it is a doctrinal problem. The assumption that the rear is safe, the assumption that expensive systems can be defended by other expensive systems, the assumption that radar cross-section equals threat detection. These assumptions are now under audit across the entire defense establishment of the developed world. The U.S. Air Force has, in the last 18 months, accelerated programs for hardened aircraft shelters at bases in Guam, Okinawa, and the Pacific Theater, specifically because the cardboard drone proved that the Chinese rocket force is not the only threat that can reach those aircraft. A cargo container full of disposable drones can do it too, and that container can be shipped anywhere. This is the broader lesson here, and I want you to understand it precisely. The cost curve of military effect is collapsing. For 70 years, the trend in Western defense procurement was upward. More capable, more expensive, more exquisite platforms, fewer of them, defended by ever more elaborate kill chains. The cardboard drone is the empirical proof that the curve is bent the other way. Mass, disposability, and autonomy now outperform exquisite, expensive, and crude in a widening set of mission profiles. And the side that internalizes this first wins. The side that does not loses its air force on the ground in the dark to objects that cost less than a smartphone. Russia, to be blunt, has not internalized this. Russia is still building Pantsir variants. Russia is still investing in $10 million interceptors to shoot down $3,000 drones when the interceptor inventory itself becomes the limiting factor within hours of any serious swarm engagement. Russia is still hardening selected air bases with thin metal sun shelters that provide essentially no protection against a top-attack munition. Russia is, in other words, fighting the last war while Ukraine writes the next one. And here is where we arrive at the climactic operation, the one that completes the picture. Because the Kursk cardboard strike was not the end of this doctrine, it was the beginning. The strike that defined the entire arc was Operation Spiderweb, and I want to walk you through it carefully because it is the single clearest expression of what the cardboard drone made thinkable. In June 2024, the SBU executed a coordinated, simultaneous strike on 4 Russian strategic air bases: Olenya in Murmansk, Diaghilevo in Ryazan, Belaya in Irkutsk, and Ivanovo. The drones were not launched from Ukraine. They were smuggled into Russia inside the false roofs of commercial cargo trucks parked near each airbase by drivers who, in most cases, had no idea what they were transporting. At a coordinated moment, the roofs of the trucks retracted, the FPV drones launched, and they flew kilometers, not hundreds of kilometers, kilometers to their targets. Tu-95s, Tu-22M3s, A-50 airborne early warning aircraft. The most strategically valuable platforms in the Russian inventory, parked in the open, struck by drones launched from inside Russia itself. Spiderweb damaged or destroyed, by credible Ukrainian and Western estimates, somewhere between 11 and 22 strategic aircraft in a single operation. The dollar value of the damage exceeded $7 billion. The operational cost to Ukraine, by Ukrainian admission, was a few $1 million in drones and logistics. And the doctrinal inheritance, the line of intellectual descent from Kursk in 2023 to Spiderweb in 2024, is unbroken. The cardboard drone proved that parked aircraft were vulnerable to cheap autonomy. Spiderweb proved that the same logic, scaled and refined, could decapitate a strategic bomber fleet in an afternoon. This is not a story about cardboard. This is a story about the marriage of cheap autonomous platforms, distributed launch geometry, and target sets that Russia treated as untouchable for 70 years. And the marriage is permanent. There is no divorce. Every Air Force, every ground force, every Navy in the world is now operating under the new rules whether they acknowledge them or not. The question I want you to sit with is this. If Russia, with the second largest air force on the planet, with layered air defenses that were marketed for decades as world-leading, with strategic depth measured in thousands of kilometers, if that force cannot defend its parked aircraft from cardboard, what does that say about the parked aircraft of every other major military? What does it say about the aircraft carriers, the forward operating bases, the ammunition dumps, the radar stations, the command posts that currently sit in the open across every contested theater on Earth? The answer, I believe, is that we are watching the opening chapter of a transformation in military affairs as significant as the introduction of the machine gun in 1914 or the aircraft carrier in 1941. And the documentation of that transformation is happening, right now, in Ukrainian operational reports and Russian airbase satellite imagery. Let me give you the verdict plainly. Russia's air force is being dismantled, not by Ukrainian fighter pilots, not by Western F-16s, not by Patriot missiles, but by the deliberate Ukrainian decision to attack the cheapest target, parked aircraft, with the cheapest weapon, disposable autonomy, at the most vulnerable moment, when the aircraft are not flying. Every assumption Russia made about strategic depth, layered air defense, and the safety of its rear areas has been falsified. The falsification is permanent. It cannot be undone by buying more pantsers. It cannot be undone by building more sun shelters. It can only be undone by the comprehensive doctrinal rebuild that Russia has shown no capacity to execute. And history will record this. History will record that in August 2023, an airbase at Kursk was struck by aircraft made of cardboard, and that the strike was not an oddity. It was the marker stone. It was the moment when the cost of military effect collapsed, and the entire global order of air power was put on notice. Ukraine wrote that chapter. Australia provided the pen. And Russia, even now, has not finished reading the sentence. The forecast is straightforward. Expect more strikes of this kind, escalating in range, in payload, in coordination. Expect the targets to expand from aircraft to fuel depots, to command bunkers, to leadership nodes. Expect Russia to continue absorbing losses it cannot replace, on a timeline its industrial base cannot sustain. And expect, within the next 18 months, a public reckoning inside the Russian General Staff about whether the Air Force, as currently structured, can survive this war at all. That reckoning is coming. The only question is whether it arrives before or after the next major strike. These are the questions that do not have simple answers, and they are the questions this channel exists to track. If you want to stay ahead of how this war actually evolves at the doctrinal level, not the headlines, the doctrine, subscribe to the channel and help us reach our goal. Every subscriber matters. Every viewer who chooses analysis over noise makes this work possible. We have a great deal more to cover in the coming weeks, because what happened at Kursk was not the end of anything. It was the beginning of a transformation that is still accelerating. Stay with us, because the next chapter of this war will not be written in the trenches. It will be written in the air, at low altitude, by objects you can hold in one hand. And the side that understands that first wins everything that follows.